Today we're going to be looking at Stanley Fish's arguments that he makes about the nature of free speech. These are by no means original arguments. In fact, he's been arguing these things in one form or another for the last couple of decades. In fact, when I was but a wee lad, or when I was around your age, one of the first books I read by him was called There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and That's a Good Thing Too. And this is an amazing book. It's really wonderful, right? And there's a ton of essays on different topics, all of them that continue to have relevance to today's political climate. And so if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I really recommend picking this up. There's one essay in here that's just golden. It's about academia called The Unbearable Ugliness of Volvos, which I really enjoy. But nevertheless, he did decide to update his arguments for a new generation. And so he just released a book called The First. And I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to explore what he says about these topics together, right? So anyway, this video, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the pandemic, which I think has raised some interesting questions about free speech and how it works. In the second part of the video, I'm going to follow his modus operandi, right, which is basically to find binaries that are sort of nestled in the idea of free speech and show how they're inevitably in tension with each other and fall apart if we pay really close attention. And then the final part of the video, I'm going to make a case for what I think is his idea about democracy and how it works. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about Stanley Fish, because he is a real interesting guy. So he's old. I mean, he is ancient at this point. I think it was 82 is what I saw on Wikipedia. And he's extremely prolific. I imagine he's going to continue writing books until he passes away. He started out his career as a literary critic. He did these fabulous reader response interpretations of Milton's text. In fact, if you ever take a Milton course, I can guarantee you're going to read something by him at some point. But at some point in his career, he seemed to get disillusioned by that. And he took this really abrupt postmodern turn. And then he became a popularizer of postmodern ideas in the academy. And so if you're wondering why the humanities seems to have such a postmodern attitude about it, Stanley Fish has probably contributed a lot to that. So he did a lot to get these really complicated French theories and ideas into the public consciousness, right? He's considered literature's counterpart to Richard Rorty in a lot of respects, and so he's a member of the neo-pragmatist tradition that emerged in the 80s and the 90s, and so I would consider him probably the other big figure in that movement. So Richard Rorty probably being the most prominent one, but Stanley Fish being close behind him in a lot of ways. He's a huge name in literary criticism, obviously. He also did a lot of work in like political theory and that sort of thing. But later in his career, he became known particularly as a legal theorist, right? And so a lot of the work that he did later in his career involved legal theory. And so that's why you're seeing so many discussions of particular cases and that sort of stuff, because he's really knowledgeable about those issues. He's also a popular intellectual or a public intellectual. He's known for writing books that are accessible to a public audience. Of course, this is one of them. The one I showed you earlier is also I would consider one as well. But he also wrote like for the New York Times and produced pieces for popular magazines and that sort of stuff as well, right? And so I very much consider him a public intellectual, and I tend to respect people that are like that. I think it's really important for academics to get their ideas out to the wider public. Now, one of the reasons I think it's interesting to talk about free speech right now is because of the pandemic. And the pandemic has raised a lot of thorny issues of free speech that I think are worth talking about. And so we're just going to talk about some of the things that appeared in my social media feed that I think is kind of interesting. So first thing is YouTube and social media platforms have definitely taken a stand against misinformation about COVID-19. There's been a lot of banning of videos that have given what medical professionals would consider problematic advice and that sort of stuff. And they've gotten a lot of criticism for that. Really interestingly, I'm a member of the Reopen California group, which I think is a trip. I mean, if you ever want to see some wild and crazy stuff, I definitely think it's worth visiting that to see what they're talking about. But there is a lot of criticism in that group about YouTube taking down videos that advocate for certain anti-vaccination positions and other sorts of things. And so that's definitely something that's sort of in the air, right? There's a lot of discussion about whether it's the proper place for social media to be doing this kind of stuff. There have been videos that have emerged of people doing some kind of weird and disturbing things. I've seen multiple videos of people either coughing or spitting on people that are walking around wearing masks, which you could consider this like a kind of assault in a lot of ways, but it's also a kind of speech, right? It's a protest against people's fear of the pandemic, right? And so I think free speech issues get raised there to a certain degree. And then there's this recent video that's been circulating just over the last week of this customer who walked into Costco and he wasn't wearing a mask and refused to wear one. And then he ended up belittling all the rest of the customers and calling them sheep and all kinds of stuff. And it's a really fascinating video. So I'm going to take like 30 seconds or so for us to watch it together. And then when we're finished, I'm going to come together and talk about it.
I'll just put you on my 3,000 follower Instagram feed, mostly locals.
Hi everyone, I work for Costco and I'm asking this member to put on a mask because that is our company policy. So either wear the mask
and I'm not doing it because I woke up in a free country.
Have a great day.
So you're going to take this cart from me.
Sir, have a great
full
day.
Of stuff.
You are no longer welcome here in our warehouse. You need to leave. Thank you very much.
Here, you put it on, I'll give you my card. He's going to take the card away because he's a There he is, walking away with all my stuff. There he goes. Because I'm not a sheep.
Now, I think it's really easy to ridicule this guy. And there's no question he's coming across as the stereotypical entitled white guy, and he probably deserves a lot of the ridicule he's receiving. But underneath what he's saying, I think you see there's some real thorny issues about free speech here, right? So first off, he clearly views what he's doing as speech. He's looking out over the crowd, calling them sheep, clearly sees them as victims of social control by the government in a lot of ways, and he's not wearing a mask as a form of protest. So I definitely think he views what he's doing as speech in a lot of ways. And then a lot of people also, one of the immediate ways they react is they say Costco has the right to ban any person from their premises for any reason that they want to, right? They're a private organization. They have the right to control speech within their boundaries, right? And that's an interesting argument, but it's problematic in a lot of ways, right? So the first reason it's problematic is that's not always true, right? In certain states, in certain areas, there are policies that require people to wear masks, right? So in a lot of cases, this is instituted on the government level, right? The second case is I think we need to be really weary about using corporations as a way to control speech among our citizens, right? I mean, do we really want like Facebook and Reddit making these thorny decisions about what's permissible to say or not say for us, right? I think there's an open question about that kind of stuff, right? And then finally, it's not even true that corporations have a blanket privilege to discriminate people regardless of the circumstances, right? There are all kinds of situations where we say, corporations cannot prevent people from saying or doing these particular kinds of things, right? And so it raises a lot of questions about free speech. And so I think what we could do is we could turn to Stanley Fish's essay and see what it helps illuminate about those considerations, right? So anyways, let's go and talk about Stanley Fish. So he's using a very particular method here, one that I think he got from Jacques Derrida, which unfortunately we're not reading because he's basically impenetrable. But if you ever get a chance, Deconstruction in a Nutshell is a good primer text if you're interested in what Derrida has to say about these issues about language, right? But anyway, so here's the approach Stanley Fish basically takes, right? So he starts with a binary, right? With various binaries that he thinks underpins the supposedly universal idea of free speech, right? And a binary is basically two values or two terms that come into conflict where one is privileged over the other, right? And so truth and falsity would be a good example, right? Where the truth is usually privileged over falsity in a lot of respects, right? So anyways, the first thing he does is he looks for binaries that are sort of wrapped up in this idea of free speech. The next thing he does is he shows how this binary creates some tension, right? And then if you really look closely at that particular distinction we're trying to make, you see how it kind of falls apart under closer examination, right? So that's the second thing he does. And then he ends with showing how this failure for this binary to maintain itself indicates that this principle we're talking about isn't universal, that it's contingent, in fact, right? And which means it's basically dependent on cultural circumstances, history, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so that's his basic method. So he takes a binary, right, that underpins this idea of free speech. He shows how that binary sort of falls apart under closer examination. And then he says, you know, that his end point is to say, well, that shows how this idea is contingent. It's political, right? And that's where he ends his discussion here, right? So let's look at some of these binaries he talks about. One of the big ones that he discusses, in a lot of ways I think the one that's most problematic, is this distinction between speech and action, right? And the speech and action distinction is essential for making the idea of free speech work, right? Because without it, right, if we didn't draw a clear division between what is speech and what is action, right, people could do anything. They could do whatever the hell they wanted, right? Because everything would fall under the category of speech, right? And so this distinction is crucial, right? But when you really start to look at it, it's really difficult to maintain what the boundary between those two things are, right? As he puts it, you can't carve out speech and pay homage to it in isolation from the actions from which it is inextricable, right? And so a good example of this is graffiti, right? So graffiti is clearly speech, right? So this is an example of one that's overtly political, where it says, occupy land, steal all, the American dream, right? So very clearly a message of protest, right? But we tend to view that as an action in a lot of ways, right? The reason we prohibit graffiti is because it's destroying a person's property, right? And that's why it's not permissible, right? And there's all kinds of other examples where this division between speech and action is really thorny, right? So burning the American flag is another good example that he gives. And I'm sure if you thought about it for another 2 seconds, you could come up with a million other cases, right? So where does speech end and action begin, right? It's really difficult to figure that out. And a lot of the ways the courts seem to try to make those decisions end up seeming arbitrary when you look at them real carefully, right? Another distinction he tries to kind of cleave apart is this idea of principle and value, right? So principles are things that are universal, that hold in all circumstances, right? So thou shalt not murder, we tend to think of that as a principle, right? Although I think that's a thornier issue than it might seem at first glance. But anyway, thou shalt not murder would be an example of a principle, right? But values are things we tend to think that are culturally dependent, that are contingent, that depend on the person and their background and their beliefs and that sort of stuff, right? So for example, a value might be, thou shalt wait until marriage before you have sex. That's considered a value, right? Another value might be using marijuana for recreational purposes is completely morally acceptable, right? And so in these particular cases where it's clearly a lot of people believe different things in these issues, we tend to be more reluctant to push those values on the wider public, right? And so what he says is he thinks this distinction really doesn't hold up very well. He says, the zone of free speech is not an oasis apart from political considerations. It is fashioned by political considerations and will always have a shape that is politically angled, right? And I think one example where you can see that real clearly is the example of anti-discrimination laws, right, which were instituted with the Civil Rights Act. And so businesses, they can't prevent people from entering their premises or getting their services just because they're African American or women or those sorts of things, right? Or based on religious considerations or whatever, right? So that's one really good example of that. Another thing he looks at is the distinction between censorship and freedom, right? Is another big distinction that he looks at, and basically he argues that freedom is impossible without censorship, right? And the way he puts it is he says, if there were no censorship in the form of social or institutional purposes and goals that mark out what is appropriate and inappropriate to say, there would be no speech that is meaningful, right? And so he's playing a little bit here, right? So he's meaning censorship in a much broader sense than just government censorship, which is usually what we're thinking of, right? But he's thinking about other things too, like language, right? For language, for example, really heavily limits what we can say and what we can't say, right? And those things are always changing, they're always contingent, so on and so forth, right? But there's other examples too, right? So ourselves, we limit what people can say and do all the time, right? And so we can't walk around naked, not so much because it's illegal, although it is illegal, right? But because it's not socially acceptable in a lot of circumstances, right? And so that's another good example, right? And then there's private corporations. Private corporations always or have the ability to censor what people are saying in various circumstances, right? So private businesses have the right to fire people because they express opinions that people view problematic. Facebook has the ability to ban whatever speech it wants from its particular forum for whatever reason it wants. Broadcasting agencies like Sinclair Media or whatever can advocate whatever positions that they want without any restrictions being placed on their speech, right? And there's an open question of whether we think this is necessarily the best way to do this, right? Should we be pushing the responsibility to do those kinds of censorship on these private institutions, right? Or should we be settling this at a government level through our elected officials and that sort of stuff? That's a difficult question, and it's tough to answer in a lot of ways, right? And so where he sort of arrives here at the end, right, is he shows that, you know, if you look real closely at this idea of free speech and all these sort of binaries that we use to maintain it, right, we see that it kind of falls apart under closer examination, right? That free speech tends to be, as he puts it, a label we put on the kinds of speech that we like, right? So when we like a kind of speech, we tend to think it should be protected by the First Amendment. But when we really don't like a piece of speech, we tend to think that it should be pushed outside of the boundaries of what we consider free speech, right? And so what he ends up with is this idea almost of democracy as something that's created, right? One that involves these continual local battles that we face over issues that arise, right? So, for example, what we do about social media, that's one of the current terrains where we're fighting over this idea of what's considered free speech and what's considered not, right? Do we want to allow people to spew coronavirus falsehoods on social media, on Facebook, right? That's an open question. We don't have an answer for that quite yet, right? And so I think in the end, you know, what does that mean for these current debates that we're having about these issues related to the coronavirus? I don't think there's a definitive answer to these things. We can't necessarily look to some universal principle to answer these questions for us, right? We have to decide them locally based on our immediate circumstances, right? And so basically we have to ask ourselves the question, right? Is protecting the wider public from the spread of the coronavirus a greater value to us than that guy's right to not wear a mask as an act of political protest, right? And I don't really have an answer to that. Once again, I don't have answers to a lot of these things, right? I think that's an open question, right? Do we think it's more important for him to say his piece in a public space, or do we think it's more important to protect the wider public from a disease that's obviously quite harmful to us, right? And so hopefully in your learning community activity today, you can answer some of those difficult questions and arrive at some answers for yourselves.